Hello, thank you for having me. I am going to do a very quick deep dive into ethics in AI and how this can help us to achieve the generative AI that we need as a society. I'll be using the terms AI and machine learning interchangeably, where machine learning can be thought of as the brain inside an AI system. So one way to wrap your head around the development of a machine learning model used in a larger AI system is to break it up into a series of steps that lead to people seeing the output. One thing this does is to help us identify the kinds of issues that come in during development and how they propagate, as well as the kinds of solutions that can come into play in order to make better technology. So throughout the development pipeline, there are specific biases that come into play, influencing everything else. Some of these are well documented, such as sexism and racism within the training data before it's even collected. And some of them are less well documented, such as automation bias, which is people's propensity to believe the output of a system, even in the face of evidence that it's wrong. Throughout all of this, human biases and their selections are propagated to further create output that people then act on. And it's not the end of the machine learning lifecycle at that point, because as people act on the output in outlets where the data is collected, they are themselves creating more data based on the decisions of the already problematic system, which then creates an echo chamber feedback loop, where the model then learns from human data that has already encoded biases in the first model decisions. So this amplifies problematic decisions over time. And I like to call this bias laundering. So the input data set defines what we care about for a model. The default approach to development is to simply use the training data that's available in a specific data set to evaluate on the evaluation data that's available in that data set. That's something called a default effect or a default bias. So if critical aspects of the problem space aren't represented in the pipeline, then deploying the model means making the value judgment that those aspects should not be represented, right? If the data, the training, the post-processing, all the different things in this pipeline creates models that disproportionately underperform on subpopulations, then there's an implicit value judgment that some populations should receive worse performance. So machine learning development is not value neutral, and by ignoring the values or by not thinking through them, we have an approach that we see today where a lot of problematic technology is being developed without deep consideration of the people it negatively affects, and with many negative effects for people. I wish I could go into more detail on all of this, but I want to bring you to some solutions, which is the role of ethics in AI. So ethics doesn't provide an answer, but it provides frameworks for analyzing problems in light of different human values. So some example human values are shown on the side here, and they're exactly the values that can be incorporated not only within the development pipeline, but within the development culture more broadly. Having a basic understanding of these different kinds of values can really help to articulate and prioritize amongst different options. So we can look again at the pipeline, but this time through the lens of ethical values. And we can see that throughout there are some opportunities to make some really well-informed decisions in order to create generative AI technology or AI technology more broadly that is beneficial for people. So in the first stage, the training data being collected and annotated, we have issues such as copyright, consent, fair pay. I like to call this the data bottleneck because it's the touch point of information flow from human thought to AI, but it's the source of an incredible amount of issues. So I'm going to focus on this a bit in particular. Here are some values relevant to data. There's a ton. There's no such thing as having the most values. Ethics teaches you about how things are always in tension. There's always trade-offs. And so what you need to do is articulate the values and think through them. So for example, we may want to release a data set to help with benchmarking and reproducibility. This is very common. This is seen as a good thing. But this comes up against the trade-offs of lack of consent, perpetuating problematic ideas. The fact that the data can't realistically be deleted yet, meaning details of individuals in the data can be continually amplified even without their consent. We may also want to aim for things like diversity within our data, representing different people. But if not done with inclusion of different diverse voices, then it comes up against issues of stereotyping and exploitation. That's when data instances are collected with a specific goal of diversity, but done in a framework of exclusion and stereotyping by people who are not actually part of the different diverse groups that are desired. So let me give an example on this one. There was some work done to collect pictures of faces for a phone unlock. And the objective was to get people with darker skin tones to agree to record videos of themselves. And then their image and likeness could be sequenced for AI training for a multi-billion-dollar, trillion-dollar company. The people who were asked were actually homeless people in Atlanta. So this is a stereotyping bias of what Black people are like. And they were paid $5 or a gift card from Starbucks, which is nothing compared to how much the company would make off of their faces. So this is an exploitative practice. That's exploitation in the face of attempting diversity. Right, so part of your choice when developing and sharing data is to identify which of these priorities are at play. What are the pros, cons of different approaches and that kind of thing. If you follow a default bias, which is just doing what everyone is doing, then the state of the art means hitting on all of these issues. So this is why machine learning isn't value neutral and why we need to really work on articulating these different trade-offs. One of the key solutions is operationalizing ethical data development. So that means defining values upfront, documenting them in transparent documentation made available to people throughout the process and even for third-party auditors. And that massively expands what it means to collect and work with the data, because now data collection itself has details and nuance that isn't otherwise there. And this creates different dedicated roles to handle different aspects of the development and corresponding artifacts that allow the values encoded to be further examined. Can be seen as a life cycle for the data as a whole, requiring continued monitoring and analysis, and then updates. I'll move on a bit to the output being generated and the sort of values at play there. And here too, it's critical to think through the different kinds of ways this technology is going to be used. So one of the main things to do is to choose metrics in light of the different foreseeable uses, including misuse, and then to disaggregate your evaluation across different subpopulations. So for example, making sure that faces are detected when present, that would be a true positive rate evaluation metric, and that this true positive rate is equal across different genders. This is a great way to make sure your model is doing what it should be doing in light of creating diverse and inclusive kinds of outputs. Finally, this is where people see the output. Well, that's where minimizing social harm comes in, and where it's really critical to provide ways for people to provide feedback on what they're seeing and flag different kinds of issues in order to have the technology further developed in light of the different things that people are finding. So it's possible to think through these kinds of values and priorities by creating dedicated work streams for foresight. Some people are good at this, some are not. And so this requires placing people in the appropriate roles to make this aspect of development really shine. And one way to approach this is to think through two main categories, people and contexts. And I'll hop over to the slide here, which I hope is a little bit more helpful. But basically, you can break up the contexts into the intended, the unintended, and the out of scope. You can break up the people into users and those affected. And by working through these different kinds of cells, we can come to understand that, for example, text-to-image generative AI could be very helpful for things like creative works from artists, but can be terrible for things like revenge porn. One method I've worked on to capture this thinking through values is called model cards, which provides a framework to share the ethical values at play in the model. Essentially, what you want to do is basic details, basic considerations, and then some analyses. And so here's some key takeaways. 1, align AI considerations to values. With processes for the consideration of the first. 2, create detailed documentation throughout development. Transparency artifacts actually create better technology because they require reflection and consideration following specific rubric, addressing issues that may otherwise be missed. They incentivize good practices, so people are less likely to release problematic technology if they're required to be transparent about issues. And it provides a way to understand successes and failures in development. And then 3, practice inclusive diversity. So diversity is when many characteristics are represented, but inclusion is when a person with underrepresented characteristics feels welcome and comfortable. Having diverse and inclusive people at the table from the start defines and reshapes what research priorities there may be. So by doing this kind of thing, we can move from majority representation of technologies to something like diverse and inclusive representation for more ethical AI. Thanks.